is the exotic Titan gauntlet Stronghold METAH. First up, these gauntlets have been pretty unpopular for a very long time. They were released back in Season of the Drifter after Forsaken, and outside of us using it during the Season of the Ya, when energy accelerant was absolutely busted and our claymore damage was doubled, I really wasn't using Strongholds, even if I was using a sword. But upon release, Stronghold's exotic perk was Clenched Fists, stating that guarding with swords increases movement speed and does not drain ammo. Shots blocked immediately after guarding will heal you. Now this perk worked exactly as it stated. You moved faster when blocking with your sword, and it wouldn't drain any sword ammo. Now when you blocked right before taking damage, you would be healed back to full HP again. But the timing on this had to be extremely precise. Essentially think parrying from like Souls games. It was a fun exotic for sure, as you were rewarded for those tight block timings, but in the end, it just wasn't worth running. Now since then, we have actually had huge reworks of swords, and we actually have an even bigger rework coming to swords, which is why we are re-reviewing this exotic today. With the release of Season of the Deep, Stronghold got an update to its functionality of its exotic perk. In the patch notes for update 7.1.0, Bungie stated that they replaced the healing from blocking shots precisely with significant damage reduction, that being 50% inside of PvE, 10% inside of PvP. This occurs while blocking with a sword. Now when you stop blocking, you gain restoration ×2, with a duration that increases based on the number of shots that you blocked. Now unfortunately, this was not working properly until update 7.1.5, which dropped just this past week. In this patch, Bungie stated they fixed an issue where the Stronghold exotic gauntlets were not properly extending the duration of restoration based on the number of shots blocked and causing it to grant restoration on dealing damage with any sword. Now we'll apply restoration after blocking damage immediately after swinging and extends its duration based on the number of enemy attacks blocked. So considering that Stronghold is finally now working as intended, here we are. This new rework is actually reflected in the new description for Clenched Fists, stating maximum guard stats on equipped swords. You take reduced damage while blocking with a sword, and rapidly damaging targets after blocking shots with a sword grants restoration for a duration determined by the number of shots blocked. Essentially, once you block a bunch of attacks from enemies and hit one with your sword, you'll be granted restoration ×2. Now in our testing, it seemed that each projectile from an enemy would give 2 stacks of perfect guard. The buff applies to you when blocking that tracks the amount of shots you've blocked and then gets converted into restoration upon hitting an enemy. One pretty cool thing to note is that each individual projectile of an enemy's attack gives you 2 stacks. So if you're fighting an enemy like a captain that shoots 3 bullets at the same time, you'll end up getting 6 stacks from just one of their barrages. The duration of restoration ×2 granted to you scales depending on the amount of perfect guard stacks you have at the time. So at the minimum of 2 stacks of perfect guard, you gain restoration ×2 for 4 seconds after hitting an enemy. And at max, which is 100 stacks, you obtain a whopping 16 seconds of restoration ×2. So how does Stronghold feel after these changes? Is it a lot more functional than before, or are we just gonna throw it right back in the vault? Well, guys, the answer is actually both. Yes, Stronghold is still a niche pick for your exotic slot, and probably always will be simply due to the nature of its functionality, and on top of that, you are using a sword in a first-person shooter. To put it simply, it's not going to be the best exotic armor piece for Titans, especially when other armor pieces exist. Things like Avian Leap, our Yeet exotic, Lordly Splendor, and a number of others. But with that being said, after these new changes with Season of the Deep, Stronghold feels like it finally has some kind of purpose in this sandbox. During our testing of Stronghold's new functionality, we brought it into Legend Law sectors and a few Master Law sectors, and in this testing, we used 2 builds focusing around 2 exotic swords. The first being Lament, and the second one being Worldline 0. Now, because Restoration is a solar status effect, running something like Lament with Stronghold and a solar subclass allows for some amazing synergy here. One fragment that we used here was Ember of Solace, where Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you have increased duration. So with Ember of Solace and 100 stacks of Perfect Guard, the Restoration ×2 granted from Stronghold has a shocking 24-second duration. Combine this with Ember of Empyrean, where Solar Weapon or Ability Final Final Blows extends the duration of restoration and radiant effects that are being applied to you, and you can use your Lament Final Blows and all of the other solar pieces of your toolkit to then keep extending that restoration that you originally got from Perfect Guard. Running Stronghold definitely has a learning curve. It's not a passive exotic you could throw on and just forget about. You need to play to its strengths. But once we actually started to get the hang of it, it felt right. When running Lament, Stronghold really helped us close distances to stay alive in tight situations with that extra damage reduction and restoration. And then of course we have Lament's anti-champion capabilities, allowing us to focus on other things in our loadouts. Yes, there are challenges when running a sword, even with this build. And the hardest part of this build wasn't even Stronghold. Honestly, it's just dealing with Lament's crazy tracking. And sword tracking in general, especially against champions, is funky. One wrong move, you lunge past a target, and suddenly you're getting shredded from behind. Then of course you have airborne enemies, which are also complicated to deal with a sword. Thanks, Bungie. Honestly, every sword you have is pretty much useless against any of these floating bosses. But when it worked properly, the synergy between Stronghold, Lament, and our solar subclass felt great, as it allowed for an almost constant uptime of restoration, giving us a lot more room to breathe in in-game activities, more so than ever before. Now, we also took Worldline 0 into these lost sectors just to see how this would combine, and this actually provided some major success with Stronghold. With this build, we ran our Arc subclass. The fragments you use here are pretty flexible, but the only one that should be mandatory is Spark of Resistance, where you are more resistant to incoming damage while surrounded by enemies. Pretty easy with a sword, but no lie guys, this build felt very strong. Worldline recently got a buff alongside Season the Deep, giving it a second heavy attack and an 8% damage boost to each heavy, making it the single best sword option in the game for burst damage. Trust me guys, we're gonna have a build here very soon, doing a deep dive on Worldline 0. Essentially though, we'd use Stronghold to build up stacks of perfect charge, and then stun a champion. We would then sprint to proc Worldline 0 and its special heavy attack, and upon hitting the champion, we'd hit for essentially all of its health, and then proc that restoration times 2 from Stronghold. This gave us enough survivability to finish off the champion with a finisher, and then either make our way to cover or continue killing ads. And if you want to really juice this build, we could take advantage of some of the artifact mods we have available in our seasonal artifact. Most of them revolve around being amplified, amped up, which lets you stay amplified longer. Electric armor, where you gain damage resistance while you're amplified. Shock and awe, where final blows while amplified will summon a burst of lightning that damages and jolts targets. You can even run thunderous retorts, where activating your super while low on health will give you more super damage. And for dipping into your neutral game abilities, we have lightning strikes twice, where you gain increased arc grenade recharge upon throwing your arc grenade. All of these perks combined alongside the decent strength of Stronghold and the amazing strength of Worldline allow for this build to flourish a lot more than we ever expected, and even more so than Lament. Granted, it's still a sword. You have to play around that playstyle, and of course around Stronghold in general. You can't just push into things in a brain dead manner, which I know to some of my fellow Titans, that's kind of a foreign concept. I just want to fist everything. What's this strategy you speak of? So is Stronghold worth using now? Is it actually meta? I just want to mention it is very good, and if you're going to be rocking a sword, Strongholds is the option to go with to enhance those weapons. You need to play to its strengths, you need to push effectively, but when you do so, it is a beautiful feeling, and Stronghold helps with this playstyle better than any other exotic. The real question is what is Bungie going to do to swords in its rework? They have been teasing us, saying that swords are going to get an overhaul. Guys, depending on that change, Stronghold, amongst all of our swords, are going to get a lot stronger. And Bungie's comparison to what this change will be is like the equivalent to the pellet spread changes on shotguns. This is going to be a fundamental change to how swords work. And what's crazy is that Bungie has already done a change like that to swords to begin with, in its blocking features, how it doesn't actually consume ammo anymore. Now though, I have to question, what are they going to do next? Strongholds feel just right with swords. The rework here, guys, is fantastic, and all of these changes are made deliberately before this overhaul to swords is to hit us. So even though today you may not want to use a sword in Destiny, tomorrow these exotic gauntlets could very well be meta. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.